I am delighted to be able to introduce you to our second panel today. And you'll remember, I think, in the first panel, how Clayton gave a whole list of things that they hadn't been able to cover. And I know that we're going to get to a number of those in this afternoon's panel. And I'm particularly looking forward to this one, which is about the legal and financial weaponry that's being used against journalists and the weapons that journalists can use to fight back. Because as we know, and we discussed a bit this morning, this issue is of particular relevance to us here in Chicago at the moment, as we've seen local newsrooms band together to sue the current administration for violation of their First Amendment rights, for, in part, as we know, targeting journalists attempting to cover protests of ICE activity in the city. So this is, I think, a particularly timely and urgent topic for us here in Chicago, as well as elsewhere. So we'll start by introducing our moderator, Doreen Weisenhaus. Doreen is second from my left there. She's a senior lecturer and director of the Media Law and Policy Initiative at Medill, with a joint appointment at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law. Prior to joining Northwestern, she taught media law and ethics at the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong and directed the Media Law Project, an educational resource for students, scholars, lawyers, journalists, and other media professionals. Before starting her academic career, Doreen was city editor of the New York Times, where she oversaw coverage of New York City, and the Times Magazine's first legal editor before becoming its law and politics editor. She also was editor-in-chief of the New York-based National Law Journal, a leading U.S. newspaper for the legal profession. To Doreen's right, I'm going to be working on my directions all day today, right? Left, right. To Doreen's right is Adam Ganeshow. Adam was newly named the first executive editor and chief content officer for Deep South Today, which is a regional leadership role overseeing the organization's editorial and content strategy across its growing network of nonprofit newsrooms. He supports news gathering efforts of Deep South Today's three existing outlets, Mississippi Today, Verite News, and The Current, and provides essential direction for the launch of new newsrooms across the South. He previously served as editor-in-chief of Mississippi Today, which grew into one of the largest newsrooms in the state and earned a reputation for some of the most impactful investigative reporting in the nation, including winning a Pulitzer Prize. On the other side of Doreen is it Chris? This is a complicated setup. Chris Casquejo was most recently a Washington-based program host and correspondent for English to Asia, VOA's English language affiliate service to the Indo-Pacific region. He appeared frequently on NDTV and WION in India, TVRI World in Indonesia, ABS-CBN, and PTV in the Philippines, and Arirang News in South Korea. He joined the VOA in 2021, previously served as a regional correspondent in Seattle for CGTN America, where he covered global corporations like Amazon, Boeing, Microsoft, and Starbucks. He also reported for the nationally syndicated First Business News program in Chicago. He is a 1995 graduate of Medill and also previously worked at television stations in Florida, Indiana, Kentucky, and Michigan. And then to Chris's left is Julie Pace, who is Senior Vice President and Executive Editor of the Associated Press, leading global news coverage for more than 100 countries. Since she assumed the role in 2021, AP has significantly expanded its digital news offerings, been awarded 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and produced an award-winning documentary on the Ukraine war that won an Academy Award and a BAFTA. Previously, she was the Washington bureau chief for AP, directing AP's coverage of the presidency, politics, and U.S. government. She also served as AP's White House correspondent and won the White House Correspondents Association Merriman Smith Award in 2013. She joined AP in 2007 as a multimedia reporter, and like Chris, she is a Medill alum. And our final panelist is Tenzin Pema. Tenzin is a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan and former director of Radio Free Asia Tibetan Service. She is a journalist of Tibetan origin with over 2 decades of experience as a reporter, editor, and newsroom leader in global media firms. She was most recently the director of Radio Free Asia's Tibetan Service, where she led critical and sensitive reporting on Tibet across multiple formats and platforms, including groundbreaking coverage of the Dej dam protests in 2024 that led to mass arrests, as well as transnational repression across borders and the erasure of Tibetan language and cultural identity in Tibetan monasteries and schools. She served as editor of strategic initiatives at Economic Times and as editorial head at Your Story Media, and she spent a decade with Reuters, where she was editor-in-chief of teams covering different regions. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and let's give a round of welcome to our panelists. And Doreen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Louise. So I also am an alum of Medill and the Pritzker School of Law, but thank you for not sharing my year of graduation. Let's just say it's not in this century. So, Louise, thank you so much for your gracious introduction of our distinguished speakers for this next panel. And they're going to help us continue this absolutely critical conversation from this morning's panel on physical and digital threats on the press, and of course our lunchtime sharing session that we had about issues that concern a lot of us. And it was so insightful to hear Peter's recitation of some of these concerns from, what is the future for our younger generation, which is very optimistic to hear. But one thing I heard over and over again was, is this permanent? Are we down the path of no return of what's happening here in the US? And all I can say from my birth of sitting and watching things in Asia for 15 years when I was at the University of Hong Kong, it doesn't have to be. There are many examples of countries like South Korea, which had a long history of martial law, going back to the Korean War and up into the late 1980s, when a number of protests actually ended in toppling the military government, and it flourished and entered an unbelievable atmosphere of free press and free expression for that country. And they operated quite well. The laws are not similar to the US, as we're going to explore a little bit here. We have the security blanket of the First Amendment. Yes, it is under attack, but there's no law like this, no constitutional protection like this in the rest of the world, where it specifically prohibits censorship and restrictions by the government against your speech. I mean, it doesn't necessarily happen in actual practice, as we've seen in recent times, but that is the cornerstone of that particular law. Now, there was the constitutional crisis in December of 2024, when then President Yoon of South Korea decided to declare martial law again. That didn't last too long, and he was impeached the following month and is no longer president. And that was the impact of civil society and citizens protesting, organization of legislation, and so forth. So my point is with this particular example is to let you know that there can be ebbs and flows, and that it's not necessarily a one-way direction down the drain, so to speak. As discussed also earlier today, we talked about in the first panel this crisis of covering ICE raids and protests, both Chicago and around the country, advice on how to protect yourself in a whole variety of circumstances, and of course, the absolutely existential and quite emotional questions of whether what we do matters. And Robertson, thank you so much for bringing up some of those issues in the last panel. The short answer is it does. So for the rest of this time, I would like to just spend just a couple of minutes just laying out a little bit of the legal landscape, what we're facing not only here, but around the world, and then I'll turn it over to the specific experiences and perspectives of our panelists here. So, as we discussed in our earlier session, this is not just a US-based problem, but a global one, as chillingly described and documented by both Lucy and Clayton for their respective organizations, Reporters Without Borders, and Committee to Protect Journalists, which won and richly deserved award, the Foley Award yesterday for the services, the vital services that they provide for journalists here and around the world. But turning our attention to the threats and problems that can accompany, grow out of, or extend beyond the physical and digital threats are the legal and financial threats, which often go hand in hand with these issues. And I'm going to quote our fearless dean, Charles Whitaker, who said yesterday in introducing this two-day event that we live in perilous times with serious assaults on media and truth, and an environment that's ripe for autocrats. And nowhere is this more evident than the increasing weaponizations of laws and the courts to harass and financially harass journalists. This includes, first category here, abusive defamation lawsuits, such as those brought by Donald Trump against CBS and ABC, and now against my old employer, the New York Times, for $15 billion, yes, billion, in which he threatened them over their coverage of his 2024 presidential election campaign, even though he won. And the complaint was thrown out of court last month as being basically lacking in merit and just riddled with invectives and language that should not be anywhere in a complaint. It was amended and filed again last week, and there it still stands. This also includes weaponization of criminal laws on national security, espionage, and anti-terrorism, such as used to convict Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, we all know about, in Russia, where even describing Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a war can bring arrests and prosecution. Evan was released from prison last year after an international campaign of support. This also includes financial crimes, such as tax evasion, fraud, money laundering, that is used to harass, intimidate, and bankrupt journalists. Just ask the Philippines' Maria Ressa, whose groundbreaking online publication, Rappler, exposed the abuse of power, the rising authoritarianism of the regime of then-President Rodrigo Duterte in his highly controversial and murderous anti-drug campaign. She was repeatedly arrested, posted bail at least 10 times, and for her courageous reporting in unbelievable circumstances, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. Fast forward to March of this year, in a significant postscript, Duterte was himself arrested and taken into custody by the International Criminal Court for his war on drugs that resulted in thousands of deaths. By the way, Maria sends her best wishes for our event, and she wasn't able to make it. She's in the Philippines at the time, but she wishes us well for this and our event that we're going to have in New York. So what can we do? One solution is that journalists have found that they can use the laws and the court to fight back, as we're seeing here in Chicago with this amazing lawsuit brought by Block Club Chicago, Chicago News Guild, and a coalition of others to try to stop the abuse. But perhaps a little later, I'm going to call on Seth from our earlier panel, who'll give us a little bit more updates on the legal ramifications and issues and what other legal resources we might have. But for now, I will go to our panelists who will share their experiences. So my first basic question to our panel is, what do you see from your perspective as some of the biggest legal threats you have faced at your organization and their challenges for you, your staff, and the community that you serve? Adam, your organization recently staved off a very interesting defamation lawsuit by the former governor of Mississippi after your team at Mississippi Today connected him with some welfare fraud scandals. Can you tell us a little bit more about that case and perhaps share more about your publications at Deep South?
Can you guys hear me? Okay, cool. Didn't know if I was doing this right. I would normally say, Doreen, that it's an honor to be at an event like this, but this sucks. It sucks that we have to be here talking about these issues, but it's our reality, right? And these conversations are just so important. They bring me life as somebody who doesn't get to talk too much about this with peers and like-minded folks. So it is an honor to be here with you. If we have to be anywhere talking about these things, this is a hell of a place to be here. So thank you for sharing your time with me, and it's been great, truly. Doreen, I'll answer your question by asking everyone to indulge me for just a second. I think for some people in the room, the students among you, it'll be a little easier than others, but try to put yourselves in the shoes of a 23-year-old entry-level career reporter who in college went to J school, fell in love with journalism, fell in love with the beauty and the mission of it, the possibility of what we could do as reporters and the way that we can impact society. Fell in love with a place in the Deep South called Mississippi that has very few journalists doing this important work, a place that the need is just so in your face and so great that you could not possibly escape it if you tried. You're a young reporter. You really want to make some sort of big impact. You've landed on the place that you have fallen in love with as well, and you find a nonprofit newsroom, scrappy, small, relatively small group of people who are trying to do the exact same thing you want to do. You have an idea for a new beat. You want to cover poverty in Mississippi, the nation's poorest state. It's a beat, unbelievably, as you have determined, that has not had any existence, had not been created ever, at least in the modern era that we could ever tell. So you start going to government meetings, the government agencies in Mississippi that are responsible for doling out welfare funds, federal grant funds that Congress appropriates, sends to states, in order for the states to sort of decide what to do and how to get that money into the hands of people who need it most, who are living in poverty. As a young reporter, you haven't really proven yourself a whole lot, but you have this great idea and you start really having this hunch that something's up. The state is not spending this money the way they need to be spending it. You start writing stories incrementally. You don't have the proof, you don't have the goods or the receipts, as they say, but you know. And you're hearing more and more and more. You're pulling this thread. You pull it for years, 3-4 years. You're trying to get at this, and along the way, it's been really hard. You're building this from scratch. You don't have a huge readership. You haven't been able to prove it, but you're really close, and you know it. But you just keep getting sidetracked, or keep getting having to face roadblocks. But you keep going. You do everything that you learned in J school, right? You learned how to file the best public records. You know how to get at source building, and you know the questions to ask, and you know the resources to turn to. And finally, you have a breakthrough. A source comes to you after years of building up and leaks a trove of text messages that shows definitively the receipts that you've been after for so long, that the state of Mississippi had been steering this funding in a way that you thought was happening but couldn't prove it. You spend every ounce of energy for the next year or so finishing the reporting. You go through the draft process. You go through the fact-checking process. You get attorneys to vet every word of your drafts, and you ultimately publish what ends up being a groundbreaking multi-part series, investigative series, that truly shocks not just the conscience of the state of Mississippi, but the nation as a whole. Fast forward a year, the impact is great. Reforms have happened. Federal investigations have been launched in the wake of your reporting. You are treated as a folk hero in Mississippi, as a 28-year-old. It's been 5 years. You're 28 now. And the Columbia J School awards you with the Pulitzer Prize. 2 days later, you're at the newsroom and a knock on the door happens, and you're served papers, initiated a lawsuit, basically, a defamation lawsuit, because the former governor, who was the central figure of that investigation, didn't like the attention you were getting. There's no legal basis. There's no legitimate legal basis for this lawsuit, but it's filed anyways. It's covered as if you had done something wrong when, in fact, you actually did everything right every step of the way. You persevered. You checked every box you should have, but you're still sort of being covered as somebody who is guilty of making these missteps along the way. That is what happened to Anna Wolf at Mississippi Today. Now, 2.5 years later, that lawsuit was dismissed at the lower level, as Doreen said, but we are still in the appeals process. We're still in it, not because there was any legitimacy to the lawsuit, but because state courts in Mississippi have virtually no precedent on cases, defamation cases like this. And the former governor, the subject of the investigation who sued us, helped build the state judicial system, which has continued this case all the way up from the circuit level now to the state Supreme Court level. The appeal is before the 9-member state Supreme Court right now. 4 of those members that former governor appointed to the court himself. An additional 2 of those he endorsed publicly for their election campaigns. So we got 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices who we know are very close with the governor, former governor who is suing us, and we're at their whim. That's intimidation, right? For the reporter, for Anna Wolf, intimidation to the highest degree. You know, the emotional just gymnastics that you have to do in her shoes, right? To just even keep covering the fallout of the investigation, the federal investigations that continue, the state reforms that have been proposed. She's got to cover all that while also knowing there's this lawsuit hanging over her head. She's a literal genius. She is gracious and has handled it incredibly well, but it's been really hard. She would admit that if she were with us. For me, her editor, I'm also a defendant in the lawsuit. You know, I'm having to lead our coverage in the years following the filing of that lawsuit of subsequent governor's races, subsequent Supreme Court races, in which candidates are openly talking about, you know, telling our reporters on the campaign trail, hey, we don't answer questions because, you know, y'all are unfair to the former Republican governor. Why should we, you know, take you seriously? Think about it from my colleague, our CEO's perspective. She runs our business operation as a nonprofit newsroom. We rely on grants and donations. That's the reason we exist. Think about it from her perspective. She's trying to build up a sustainable local news model that keeps us going, that keeps us, you know, makes us available to do these sorts of investigations over and over and over again for the long run, but knowing that former governor who might have a court system that's totally in his corner, regardless of what the law says, regardless of what we did or didn't report, and what he's claiming that we did or didn't do, it could still hurt our business chances in the short and long term if courts decide that we're guilty of something that we weren't. So, you know, that's the situation. I'm sorry to answer your question in that way, but that is what we have been dealing with. And, you know, I know everybody here is going to be able to tell you that this is not unique. We are not. It's one case of several that we've had to consider very directly, but it is very much part of a playbook that has been created over time, not just in America, but in other countries. But it's also in America right now being filled with additional pages, new pages to turn. And it is being used certainly in a state like Mississippi, in a case like Mississippi Today's case that still continues. I promise it will be replicated. So that's where we are.
Thank you so much for sharing that. No, and I really appreciate the background that you presented it as, because it reflects so much of the experience of our high school students and our young journalists and our students here at Medill as they begin to explore where it is that they can go and take their careers. 6 out of 9 justices on the High Court who are supportive of a chief executive. Where have I heard that before? Yeah, and so that also raises the issue, and I'd love to know if there was conversations here about not just this case, but other types of cases where you're establishing legal precedent, and maybe it won't be good precedent, right? So this not only affects your case, but here in Mississippi, but also throughout the red states. I wonder if you can address those concerns.
100%. I mean, there's, like I said, there's no legal precedent in Mississippi at all here. So we know that every step we take in both our legal defense and also our ongoing coverage and the way that we conduct ourselves just journalistically, editorially, every step of the process here is being closely watched, not just by folks in our profession, of course. This is something that will affect everyone across the states, like you said, but the politicians across not just Mississippi, but other similarly structured government or political states, this is it. I mean, they're watching it closely. We know that. We know that the former governor is part of a huge network that is directly tied in with Donald Trump's administration. Like, this is not theoretical. This is part of the structure that we are living in right now. And the precedent-setting nature of these cases is so important. So thankfully, we have been so grateful and fortunate to have a lot of legal support. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I don't think they're represented here this week, but I know they're friends of the school, and they're great folks. They've been really wonderful in helping us, connecting us with big-time legal minds who have helped us directly with the case, but also they've helped us create this network of other journalists around the country and world who either are going through something like this right now or have been through it already, who have been providing us really great guidance. But the precedent-setting nature of these things is really the whole ballgame in so many ways. We lose this one case, we'll be fine. We're going to go raise money to it. We'll ask people to help us cover whatever the settlement or not settlement, but final judgment amount might be, whatever. I don't think we're headed there, but honestly, that's kind of the least of my worries as a journalist. I want our organization, our newsroom, to sustain itself and not have to pay out a crazy thing like that. But we have to sort of think about these threats as we're fighting on behalf of journalists all across the country, not just in our newsroom.
Thank you so much for that. And we will be talking about Reporters Committee a little bit later when we talk about solutions and legal support as well. So we go from this smallish nonprofit organization that's growing throughout the South here. But I want to address the next question to Julie as Executive Editor of Associate Press, which is one of the oldest and largest agencies in the world. And some might be surprised that it is a nonprofit.
Not-for-profit.
Not-for-profit, excuse me. Yes, a not-for-profit. So can you share your concerns on some of the legal threats and intimidations for Associate Press with the thousands of reporters you have here and abroad, because you're in almost 100 countries, so you're facing all kinds of global media laws as well as dealing with the issues here. But perhaps, and you touched on it a little bit during our sharing session, AP's own lawsuit against the Trump administration.
Sure. Thank you very much. Happy to be here with everyone. So, the first thing I would say is that, while many of these issues that we're talking about today do feel new in the United States, you're absolutely right. We've been facing many similar challenges globally for many years. And Adam hinted at this. There is a bit of a playbook that you see around the world when it comes to governments trying to restrict press freedoms. And so we, in some ways, feel quite prepared for this moment because we have been dealing with it internationally, really in every region of the world. I can point to very specific situations where our journalists have, been in court, where we have been defending specific articles, where we've been defending our overall right to operate in countries. So in some ways, again, we are quite prepared for this moment, and yet it does feel difficult having this play out in the United States. And it's played out most acutely for us at the AP earlier this year when we were kicked out of the White House press pool for the terminology that we use to refer to the Gulf of Mexico. I'll just say quickly, at the AP, we have been setting style and standards guidance for the industry for decades. And we always come at that from the perspective of being a global news organization and having to make decisions that are reflective of our global audience and using terms that are most widely understood. And fortunately, because we've been making those decisions for decades, we have quite a bit of precedent when it comes to things like, what do you name a body of water? And so when we issued our style guidance around the Gulf of Mexico, we were able to draw on how we'd handled actually quite similar situations in the past. I would encourage you to actually read the style guidance. It's quite nuanced. We decided that we needed to maintain the Gulf of Mexico as the name, but would refer to President Trump's executive order renaming the body of water the Gulf of America within the U.S. For that, we were kicked out of the press pool. And what was remarkable about the moment was not only that we were kind of playing this out over something that felt quite small and insignificant, but that it was so blatant. It was we don't like what you're saying. The government doesn't like what you're saying, and therefore we will retaliate against you. And I remember in those days as it was playing out, I just kept thinking to myself, this is a classic First Amendment violation. The government retaliating against you for speech. And the other thing I kept thinking is that this isn't really about the AP. This is about whether the government can retaliate against anybody for what they say. And that's really the reason that we decided to take a step that frankly did not feel very comfortable for us. We are an independent, nonpartisan news organization. We pride ourselves on being nonpartisan, on not having political perspectives and political opinions. We don't want to be suing any president in the early days of their administration. But again, it wasn't about us and whether we were in the press pool or not, though I think it's vital that we're there. This was about whether the government of the United States can retaliate against any one of us if they don't like what we say. So we were really gratified that we won our lower court hearing, and a Trump-appointed judge issued a really thorough and really resounding decision in support of the First Amendment. I would encourage you to read it because it actually is quite encouraging when it comes to the history of the First Amendment and why it is so vital in the United States. We, like Adam, we are in the appeals process right now. We actually have a hearing, oral arguments in the appeal on November 24th. We expect this will, play out for quite a bit of time here. But again, I just want to go back to what I said. We really feel like, yes, we are of course standing up for our own rights as the AP, but it is so much bigger than us. This really is about the First Amendment and the protections that it provides to all of us.
Thank you so much, Julie. So for Chris and Penzan, you've both devoted much of your career also on the global context. So AP is both global and domestic here, but there are domestic aspects to your work for the U.S. Agency for Global Media at Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. And so perhaps you both can share what you consider the importance and harm that's caused by these financial and legal threats and attack, especially from your vantage point of in and around Asia. So maybe, Chris, if we could start with you, tell us a little bit more. I know you addressed it briefly during our sharing session at lunchtime, but give us more a little bit into the nitty-gritty of the background and latest developments of the shuttering of USAGM and VOA, including its current battles in the court.
So yeah, I touched on it briefly. In mid-March, an executive order titled "The Voice of Radical America" shut us down, effectively shut us down, and hundreds of contractors were terminated, and they were going to go through the they were going to go through the reduction in force process that all federal employees have to go. That affected 600 of our full-time employees, and 500 contractors were going to be terminated with 2 weeks' notice at the end of March. But our chief White House correspondent, Patsy Widakuswara, and our press freedom editor, Jessica Jarrett, and our director, Mike Abramowitz, sued in separate lawsuits, basically alleging that this was executive branch overreach because Voice of America is funded and regulated and administered by several statutes that were passed by previous Congresses. And They combined the lawsuits in March because Abramowitz's lawsuit originated in New York, but they moved the venue to D.C., and so they combined the two cases. And in April, Judge Lamberth, was he the judge in your case? Oh, okay. So Judge Lamberth, who's a Reagan appointee, issued a preliminary injunction in April to, one, restore employment status of all employees and contractors at USAGM, restore funding for some of the USAGM grantees like Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, and 3, restore VOA programming to its minimum statutory requirements. So the government appealed the first two, and that's why they were allowed to proceed with the firings of the contractors in May, while the court decided the merits of the case. And so now they're really wrangling over point 3, and that is kind of where we are right now in the middle of this government shutdown. Before the shutdown, Judge Lamberth gave the administration 10 days to explain why they're not complying with his order to restore programming. And if you look at his ruling, I encourage you to go to savevoa.com and read his ruling, because to me it's basically judicial speak for asking the administration, WTF, why aren't you complying with my order and why is it taking you so long? And he actually pretty much invited the plaintiffs to file contempt charges against the defendants in the case, the administration and the person who's a former broadcaster in Arizona. I don't want to say her name. Why they're not complying with this order. And so the immediate goal is to stop or slow down the reduction in force layoffs and restore VOA operations in independence. But, what's happening is we're in a shutdown, and a continuing resolution would continue the funding for the current fiscal year, 2025, which we're funded. So we are fighting to be back on the air, but the clock is running out. They're trying to figure out a budget for fiscal year 2026, and we haven't received any word that we are going to be budgeted for the next fiscal year, except that House Republicans indicated that they wanted to fund international broadcasting to the tune of $650 million, which would be about a $200 million cut from what we were receiving in fiscal year 2025. And for context, that's less than $1 billion. The big, beautiful bill spends $150 billion on immigration enforcement. So international broadcasting is not even 1% of what they are spending on immigration enforcement. And the second part of your question is, so the threat to us is we're fighting for our very survival. And what is the effect in Asia is there is an information vacuum in Asia, and the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin, they were high-fiving when we were shut down in March, and Kim Jong-un as well. So authoritarian, autocratic governments were celebrating because Voice of America has been the biggest thorn in their side since 1942, because we show the parts of the world where press freedom is not guaranteed in the Constitution like it is here, that we can cover our government without fear or favor. So that's why these autocratic governments want a shutdown, because we model press freedom to places where they necessarily don't want a light shined on press freedom.
Thank you so much for that very detailed recitation of where we're at right now. So hopefully the money spigot will be turned on again. But you mentioned about how this brings the attention to the dictators, to those strongmen in the region, authoritarian governments. And Robertson talked about this as well in the first panel, how the strongmen are empowered by what they're witnessing here in the US. And I'll go even further. During Trump 1.0, I was in Asia at that time, and we saw governments modeling their behavior very specifically, using languages in their laws of the press as enemy of the people, fake news, and so on. That happened in the Philippines, that happened throughout Asia and other parts of the world, and they also knew that the US government was not going to flex its muscles and do anything about it, right? They were not going to say there are human rights abuses, we're going to withhold aid to your particular country. So it was really quite an interesting development, which brings me to Tenzin. As someone with more than 2 decades as a journalist in global media and as former director of Radio Free Asia's Tibetan service, you know firsthand the devastation of the loss of something like RFA. Could you share what RFA is, or I hate to say was, and what it did and the stories it can no longer tell that are important for the rest of the world and to the US?
Thank you. Thank you, Doreen. And I want to say that I'm humbled to be in this room with newsroom leaders who are leading this fight against the threats to press freedom. So before I go into my interpretation and answer your question, I want to read directly from what our audience says is the loss that they expect to face from the shutdown of RFA. So this is a source from inside Tibet, and she writes, the shutting down of these services is to sever the Tibetan people from their resonance, their reflection, and their hope. We must ask, when Tibetan children grow up hearing only a single narrative, when villagers and nomads can no longer receive truthful messages from afar, when monks are trapped in a web of data and ever-watching cameras, who will tell them that their world is not the only one written by the Chinese government? So I think it's important to have a sense of like the full scale of the harm that's going to be caused by the shutdown of RFA, to have a sense of what prompted the starting of RFA. And it goes back to 1989 when you had the Tiananmen Square massacre that caused the deaths of tens of thousands of students. And that prompted US leaders to, make a call to start this surrogate domestic news service that can pierce through, the censorship that the Chinese government has put in place, and also give people an understanding of what is happening inside China and the regions that are occupied by China, such as Tibet, the Uyghur region that is called East Turkestan, as well as Inner Mongolia. And so RFA was started by the US Congress nearly 3 decades ago. And today, as before the shutdown, we had news that was being disseminated in local language, in our local dialects, in 9 different languages, serving 9 different regions that are under authoritarian regimes, where there is no press freedom or very limited press freedom, and where governments around the world have no understanding, no eyes and ears on the ground, and in terms of what's happening in these regions. So how do you hold this government to account? And so what did it result in the US and in regions around the world where RFA had presence? Of course, it resulted in furloughs, it resulted in the layoffs, it resulted in the termination of contracts. But I want to touch on what we lost in terms of the greater impact, and that's what I started with in terms of what our audience is saying, right? And that is for audiences in these regions, services like RFA, VOA were a lifeline to receive uncensored, truthful, accurate news and information, because the only information source that they have is the state media and the Chinese propaganda. And so for many people in these regions, they risk their own personal safety to even listen, tune in to these broadcasts. So in places like Tibet, where I'm from, we have people who go up to the mountains so they can tune in and listen and escape the surveillance and the camera networks that are everywhere, so that they can listen into the news and access and get their morning tea. And that's the code they use, so that they, to show that they've gotten their breakfast, they've gotten their food. And another code word they use is also to say that networks like RFA and VOA are also medicine for the soul. And so they say they've lost the medicine for their soul. And sorry, it's personal. But also that it was about providing surrogate domestic news. And why is domestic news important? Because all of these regions, people in these regions don't have access to what's happening in the village nearby, because they have access only to what the state allows. And the fact that, we had all of this news being disseminated in local dialects, in different dialects, like in RFA, Tibetan Service was the only one that had news that was being broadcast in the 3 main dialects of Tibetan, which is Uyghur, Amke, and Kamke. And that's something that is the only one in the world. And it now serves as, it was serving at least, and I have to be mindful of my tenses, it was serving as a guardian of language preservation, because in Tibet, what is happening in regions like Tibet, East Turkestan, as well as in Inner Mongolia, is that the very language is under threat of erasure in schools, in monasteries. And so when you have this news broadcast being disseminated in your own language, it also enables language and cultural preservation, and it at least delays the erasure of one's identity. And let me also talk to you about source networks. We have great media organizations that strive to have access to these regions. But we heard before about trust and about how communities trust, the reporters who they know. And likewise, our sources trust the reporters in these services because they know them personally. And the reporters who are reporting this news are also doing it at great risk to themselves. But the sources who share the information are doing it because they personally know the reporters. And so often what we've lost is a source, an irreplaceable source that was being used by the UNHRC, by media organizations around the world, as well as by advocacy and rights groups, to have an understanding of what is happening on the ground. Because often these are not major events or standalone events. These are insidious, events that would otherwise go unreported because there might be a single arrest somewhere, and they're not arrests of like 300 people, although that's what happened, or hundreds of people, that's what happened with the Dege arrests. But I want to highlight that, because you have now lost media services like RFA and VOA, you no longer have this meticulously created networks of trust and sources that have taken years to be built. And what that also results in is that you have specialist reporters who are able to identify when media organizations are starting to use language that is reflective of Chinese propaganda. But now, when you don't have organizations like this that can call it out, what do they refer to? For instance, Xizang, that is being used to replace Tibet, so that Tibet is erased altogether from memory. Media organizations are slowly starting to use that. But how do they understand that that's actually another means of erasing Tibet from the global map. And likewise for all of these other regions as well, from Myanmar to Cambodia to Laos. And finally, I want to also talk about what Chris was talking about, as well as Julie, about countering this propaganda, the Chinese propaganda, where there's so much of money that is being invested to spread, to improve China's image in the world, as it's called, but also this, exporting of the Chinese media model, which is basically like a fusion of censorship, propaganda, as well as mass digital surveillance, as well as the weaponization of the legal framework. And we're seeing that now becoming so much more pervasive around the world and no one there to counter it. So going back to what Chris was saying, you only need to know who's celebrating to understand what we're going to lose. Authoritarian regimes around the world celebrated when VOA and RFA, faced these challenges. And people from all of the other regions, where we have our audiences, are the ones who have talked about what they will lose. And I'm going to also just quote one of them, who says that even under the weight of surveillance, Tibetans inside Tibet still listen to remember their past, to understand the present, and to imagine a future that's their own.
Thank you so much for that really incredible emotional sharing that you had. Chris, I'd like for you to add a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, something's going on in the news right now with the shooting of the drug boats in South America. And our Latin American service, our Spanish language service that has affiliates in Central and South America, would be all over this story and explaining the nuances of it. And they're not on the air, so the only perspective that's being put out there is the local perspective and what the Chinese are saying about these shooting of these drug boats. And I want to go back to, we covered meetings of world leaders like NATO and APEC in 2023 when then President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping met at the estate where Dynasty was filmed, for you 80s fans. And, we were working 18-hour days, and we were covering everything that happened. Protests. They shut down the Bay Bridge, and it caused traffic nightmare in the Bay Area. But there was one moment where I noticed a scrum broke out around then San Francisco Mayor London Breed, and it was Chinese state media. I recognized them because I used to work for CGTN America as their Seattle correspondent, so they were my former colleagues. And she was talking about how San Francisco would ensure the First Amendment right to protest for the protesters when Xi Jinping's motorcade went by. And I knew that that was never going to see the light of day on Chinese state-run media. So I made sure that my entire organization knew that we got this. We got it in front of Chinese state media, and it probably aired in 49 different languages on VOA. So again, it's an example of showing these parts of the world that, hey, protests under the First Amendment are legal in the United States, whereas, an audience that consumes CGTN or Xinhua would not have seen this particular soundbite.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Chris. So what is the underlying thread that ties all of this together? Could it be Trump 2.0 that has had this major ripple effect, not just domestically, but around the world? Julie, so you were Washington Bureau Chief at AP in 2017, so you saw Trump 1.0. What would you describe and kind of predict a little bit for us as the differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0?
Sure. I mean, I think there are significant differences. I think that the biggest one, and it plays out in multiple ways, but it does impact this issue that we've been talking about. I think the biggest one is simply the first time around, the president and his advisors, they did not think they were going to win. And no matter what they kind of say now about that, I mean, I was in conversations with them on election day. They did not think that they were going to win. And so they weren't fully prepared for what they would take on in that first year. And so there was a level of, and this is just, again, factual. This is not from a political standpoint. There was just a level of disorganization and uncertainty, and there were conflicts within the administration over what the priorities should be. There were conflicts over the decisions that were made. There was backbiting within the administration. Leaks were happening, people trying to pit, one faction in the White House against the other. So it was just quite a lot of chaos. And the result was that they just weren't organized when it came to a number of things, including the way that they would approach the media. And as a result, what you found during the first term is actually most of the structures around the media, most of the traditions around the media in the White House press corps, certainly the funding for organizations like VOA, RFA, Corporation for Public Broadcasting was all left untouched. There was not an organized sort of movement around that. What we saw happen in the 4 years between the two Trump terms is that there was much more of a plan that was being built. And again, that applies to any number of things, but it also did include the ways in which the Trump administration, if he won again, were going to go after the media. And so they did come in with a very real plan, and they had been laying the groundwork for, again, a lot of what we saw with the cuts to media organizations. They had been building the groundwork for that so that when some of these actions were taken, there was public support among at least enough people and enough members of Congress, to restrict funding, enough skepticism, criticism that had been levied against traditional news organizations to make it, not quite so controversial to take some of the actions that we saw. So I think it is just that organization and that planning that has led us to this point where we're not even a year in and we're already seeing such significant actions against freedom of the press.
Thank you so much for sharing those observations, Julie. So hopefully we'll just, see where this all leads us. But this leads me to my final question before we open up for Q&A. And that is, those of you who were fortunate to be here last night's keynote speaker, Wendy McMahon, a former CEO of CBS, urged us to find solutions to the threats that we face, especially over the fear of financial annihilation by cutting off government funding or by being litigated to financial ruin, which is an issue that Adam has brought up. So, but what can we do? What strategies and solutions can we adopt to preserve our roles and goals in a democratic society? And I'll start with you, and we'll work our way back down the line.
I don't know exactly. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I have a solution to it. I don't. We at Deep South Today, I will give ourselves a plug here. We're really working hard to find these solutions, and the framing in which we're kind of approaching the question all flows through local or hyper-local coverage. With respect to my colleagues here who have very wide, regional, national, international audiences, I don't know what to say to you. But from my perspective, I think the way that we can rebuild trust is meeting people directly where they are. I mean, the day that, I tell this story all the time, the day that we got sued by the former governor, the actual lawsuit hit the courts, we got served the papers and everything. That day, I went to dinner. I had a dinner reservation in Jackson that night. And at the table directly next to us was one of Phil Bryant's, the former governor's, longtime senior advisors. And he was on a date with his wife or whatever. And he came to the table and just said hello and just asked about my family and what was going on. We know each other, right? So, that all goes to show, even in the face of just the worst tendencies of, some of our worst actors right now, there are relationships that matter, or there's room for relationships that matter. We see these people in the grocery stores. We go to church with them. We interact with people at the local level in a way that we just don't when we're talking about White House policies and how they're trickling down to your community. But if you tell the story about that White House policy trickling down to the community through that lived experience of the person in your community, it can mean something more. So I don't know, like that's such a broad answer. It's not gonna like help anyone here, I feel like, take away anything they haven't thought of before. But we really do think about a solution to rebuilding trust, especially with readers and audiences at that local level, because they know us theoretically, we know them, we can relate to each other better at that level than we can at a broader scope.
But that's a very real and concrete goal to have, to rebuild this trust, which we've heard over and over again throughout the course of today. So I will move to Chris.
As VOA and USAGM and RFA and RFE are in the fight for their lives, what you can do is go to savevoa.com, and there's a form where you can contact your representative in Congress and your 2 U.S. senators in your state and tell them why you think it's important that the U.S. continues to project its values of democracy and a free press around the world, especially in areas where it's not guaranteed in the Constitution. And I'm inspired because a lot of my former VOA colleagues are moving into the content creator space, because we know that our affiliates need this information out there to counter these Chinese narratives. And I'm probably a rare person who worked for both Chinese state-run media for CGTN and US government-funded VOA, so I believe I have a unique offering, and I'm going to enter the content creator space next month with a show called China and Us, a play on China and the US and across the Indo-Pacific. So please follow and subscribe when I launch it. And then also, just continue to support local media and independent journalism, because what happens in your backyard affects you more than what's happening in DC, although it doesn't feel like it right now. And vote. The way to make your voice heard is to vote. You know, Virginia has an election coming up on November 4th. So does New Jersey. There are special elections with redistricting in Texas and California. So if you're residents of those states, vote, and vote in the primaries next year.
Thank you. Julie.
So one thing I would say is that, I think it's really important that news organizations stand together right now. And I think, unfortunately, that hasn't always happened this year. I think we've seen it happen recently with the situation at the Pentagon, where news organizations did stand together and say, hey, look, we're not going to agree to these new conditions that will infringe on First Amendment rights. And I think there was real power in that. It was a really important moment that news organizations across the political spectrum stood together. If I go back to February, March, when we were in the middle of things, I said quite a bit coming out of that. I got lots of private notes of support from people and very few public statements of support. And I understood why. It was a scary time. I understood why. But if we don't stand together, why should we expect anybody else to stand with us? And I do think that there are some really brave and important voices in conservative media that have spoken out on this issue to say, I may not agree with this position of this organization or with this piece of reporting, but I agree that I wouldn't want the government to tell my journalists what to say, and I wouldn't want us to be restricted if the roles were reversed. And I think that's really powerful, and I'm really appreciative of those organizations that have stepped forward. That's why it's important to us at AP to be with organizations when they find themselves in these situations, because we know that the tables can turn so quickly. So I just encourage those in media to really think about the power that we have together and the lack of power that we have when we're divided.
Well, that's what happened with the Pentagon and all the requirements that they were put on journalists, and from Fox News to AP, giving up your credentials rather than giving in to the restrictions that were placed. Tenzin.
I'm going to take off from what you said, Julie. For me, what I think is necessary is individuals using their personal sphere of influence, as well as institutions and organizations to come together to protect journalists and their sources so they can continue to do this work. And what gives me hope is also that we have seen this during this crisis that RFA faced. For example, I was just thanking Julie on behalf of all of my editors and everyone at RFA, because when our funding was cut and we lost access, we lost access to AP, Reuters, and AP made that service available for us for free. And that allowed us, even amidst all of this uncertainty, to continue to do the reporting, the important stories that we wanted to tell, albeit with very, a small number of people. But I think that gives me hope. And also platforms like this that Northwestern and Medill has made possible, as well as the safe havens that universities around the U.S., particularly where I'm at University of Michigan, and what Wallace House and Lynette Clemetson has done, has allowed journalists like me and other exiled journalists to have a place, a safe haven, where they often it's a thin line between being deported and being maybe imprisoned to actually finding a sense of purpose, a renewed sense of purpose to continue to do the work we want to do. I think that opportunity and that enabling of journalists and is critical, and I think that gives me hope. But I also want to add to what we are talking about in terms of individuals and American citizens using their right to actually reach out to their representatives and to make the case for why platforms that cater to marginalized communities and is so critical at this point of time, especially as you try to counter China's attempts to influence the world. And I think one of the key things, funding is definitely, having stable sources of funding is definitely important, and also enshrining these protections that will make sure that despite whatever be the political shifts, that that journalists can continue to fulfill the mission irrespective of these changes. But I think what's critical is also making the case for shortwave broadcasting. And I know that might seem like I'm taking everyone back a few centuries, but it is critical in regions like Tibet, in regions like East Turkestan, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, in Laos and Vietnam, and in all of these places where your phone is a listening device, right? And where VPNs are illegal, where there's such heavy censorship, and where there are cameras everywhere. And so shortwave broadcasting allows people to have a certain sense of, basically not being tracked, right? In terms of who's listening, when, where. And that's what I mentioned earlier about people going to the mountains to listen. And I think also when you have disasters, and as we saw earlier this year, there was a major earthquake that broke in Tibet. And in times like that, the only way to get information across is also through shortwave. And especially today in the era of misinformation and disinformation that I think, Julie, you spoke about earlier, I think this is critical to have shortwave.
Thank you so much on that. And I know I said this was the last question, but as the moderator, I also am utilizing the moderator prerogative here. I do want to point out the unique role that we have as academics and universities, at least for the time being, to be a source of support and a catalyst for change. And one of those things is having conferences like this, but also providing the resources that they need. And I'm going to tap into someone from our prior panel, Seth, just to quickly run over some legal resources that are available to journalists, and including from high school students, Medill students, and then throughout the profession as well. And Ivan, if you could switch to the next slide, please. He's back.
Yeah, encore. How about that? Well, we've talked about the RCFP. They've got a legal hotline. You can fill out a form on their site, or there's also a phone number if you just Google RCFP legal hotline. Easy to find. They connect they connect journalists and news outlets all over the country with lawyers, pro bono lawyers, who are often able to help out, particularly in emergency situations, but also with longer-term litigation projects. Another organization that does a similar thing is Lawyers for Reporters. So those are two options you can reach out to. If you have already spent your own money or your own newsroom's money on lawyers and would like some of that money back, you can apply for grants through the Society of Professional Journalists Legal Defense Fund, and The Intercept also runs a press freedom fund for that same purpose. Of course, there are also resources at the local level, ACLU chapters, National Lawyers Guild chapters, First Amendment clinics at universities. In Chicago specifically, though, I would note that, we're a community that is of a size where there are arguably enough media lawyers, but not an overwhelming number of media lawyers. So journalists and newsrooms here can get to know pretty much every law firm in town that could potentially be helpful if you run into these issues. If you call RCFP and tell them you need a lawyer in Chicago, they're going to connect you with probably Lovey and Lovey. They're going to connect you with Mandel Mankis. They're going to connect you with Barron Harris Healy. They might connect you with my former law partners at Clark Hill. It was a different firm when I was there, but since acquired by Clark Hill. They might connect you with Don Craven, who was the Illinois Press Association's lawyer and is probably looking for clients now since they kicked him out for having a backbone. So, those are, if you want 5 minutes on those lawyers' calendars just to get to know each other and say, I just want to talk to you in case I ever need your services, it might be worth your time to have those calls or pull them aside at some conference or find them around town. Because, unlike New York or LA, where that are national, international media capitals with hundreds of lawyers, that's not us. These people are accessible. So, those are some of the resources that are available if you need representation in an emergency. Of course, I encourage news outlets that have the funding to do it, to retain counsel, to go on offense, as the AP has done, as plenty of others have done, and vindicate First Amendment rights. Also encourage people to get creative, because what I'm always saying about this administration is they don't care that much if they lose First Amendment cases. If they lose 9 and win 1, the 9 are just the status quo holding, and the 1 is a new door that they can barge through to further infringe First Amendment rights. So if we can find claims other than First Amendment claims that aren't about rights but are about money, we have explored shareholders' derivative suits. We have bought shares, and I know RSF has done the same, in a variety of publicly held news companies so that we can file what's called shareholders' derivative suits, which are suits where you step into the shoes of the company, of the shareholders, and have recourse against those who are doing wrong by the company, whether they be outsiders or whether they be the company's own directors. I keep saying, just in case somebody can think of a way to run with it, Trump, in his counterclaims against CBS in the interview editing lawsuit, he made an unfair competition claim. And the way he was able to make that claim is by saying Truth Social is a competitor of CBS. So, that's his own words. By his own pleading, as ridiculous as it may be, he is using his official power as president to undermine his competitors as the owner of a media company. I don't know, maybe other lawyers who are still practicing can figure out something to do with that. But I just encourage, of course, go to RCFP, go to all these organizations if you need immediate help, but also think about strategies if you've got the resources and the will to go on offense.
Thank you so much, Seth, for joining in on that. So just so you know that CPJ, Media Defense, Thomson Reuters also does a lot of global legal assistance. And then Reporter Shield is also funded by the same group that does Lawyers for Reporters, in which they offer insurance policies. So they provide 3 services for premiums of anywhere from, it averages about $3,000 a year, but it provides newsroom with pre-pub review for investigative reporting. If you get a threatening letter, they will respond to that letter and also provide some defense, or at least set you up with lawyers as well. Okay, I would love to hear now from the audience if there's any questions that you might have. Yes, this table has 3.
Hi, thanks so much for coming to talk with us. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll ask my most concerning one for right now.
Thank you.
I think, so a lot of what seems to be happening, right, is like Trump administration, for instance, or the Mississippi former governor, they make this frivolous claim that doesn't have any merit, and then they lose, and they appeal. And what ends up happening is that maybe you're not losing legally, but you're losing time, you're losing money, you're losing like the mental health of it all. And it seems like it's a lot of these like extra legal consequences that are actually the most real and the most burdensome. What can we do to sort of avoid having to pay the cost, like those extra legal costs? Because it seems like there's not really a good way to avoid those costs right now.
I'm going to throw it to anyone here who wants to take it, but that's one of the premises behind Reporter Shield, for example. By having this insurance policy, it's not like the traditional defamation liability insurance. It tends to be a little broader than that. They provide that infrastructure for you. It's a drop in the bucket, but I'd like to hear from other people.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think you've hit on something really important here. It's like, look, I believe so strongly in the need to stand up in these situations and take these fights through the court system. You know, Adam and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. Like, I have to be honest, this has been an enormous drain on us as an organization, and we're a quite large news organization, but the amount of just time and energy from sort of the very top people in the organization, from our White House team, you know, our White House reporters and photographers who should be covering the news have instead been spending time talking with lawyers and preparing to be witnesses. You know, it's an enormous drain, and that's one legal fight that we have going on, and we have many that are going on. And I think that is a tactic, right? I mean, that is one of the tactics is to tie up news organizations, to distract them from their reporting, to damage them financially, because again, it's even with insurance, it's financial resources that we're putting into this. So, you know, I wish there was an easy answer to that. I think some of it is just kind of acknowledging that, yes, this is an enormous drain of resources on news organizations.
This is really a bleak response. I think Julia's just right. Like, this is exactly what you should be thinking about. You know, in an academic setting like this, I think it's important to just say, I think this is just our new reality. Like, you need to budget, whether you're budgeting your time or financial resources if you have them or run an organization, but budget for yourself a little bit of bandwidth to just know that this is a very real possibility, that your mental health is going to take a hit if you decide to pursue journalism as a career. In America today, this is part of it. And I think in academic settings, I think professors need to be teaching that to their students. There's probably a better way to do it than the way I just described it, because we're not trying to scare everyone away, but you know, I don't know anyone in journalism right now, whether they have faced one of these lawsuits or not, who isn't fearful about what could happen. And for those of us who have experienced it already, you know, there's no point in pretending like it won't. So, you know, think about it, just prepare yourself as best you can. There's logistics, as Seth was saying, and others about, you know, how to actually set up some preparation ahead of time. But, you know, it's just part of journalism in America right now.
Another question? Yes.
I just wanted to add a little bit to that, to say that, you know, all the other challenge is also that all the journalists who are also tracking these lawsuits and covering it, I've heard from former colleagues who say that they've lost track. And so we've not even been able to get the kind of coverage that you would want to sort of like see, especially when, you know, major news organizations are being dismantled. And I think the other point is also that in the case of RFA, for instance, it created, even though we were having these rulings that were in favor, it created enough uncertainty that the administration or the management, the RFA management, had to follow all of these journalists. And ultimately, we were fighting for each month's funding to come through. So basically, it impacted all of the reporting that we could have done.
Barbara Frank, Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. One thing that we can all do is donate to nonprofits like Report for America, Reporters Without Borders, Committee to Protect Journalists, AP, and even Medill School of Journalism's local news initiative. Very, very important.
Thank you. Natalie.
Hello, I'm on faculty here, Natalie Moore. Love that we're talking about solutions, but a lot of us have been talking here about what we can do as an institution, as a thought leader. This conference is part of that. I appreciate what you said, Adam, about what we should be teaching to the students, but I'm wondering if there's anything else. And when I'm asking, I mean, that can be anything like, I don't know, PPP kits, amicus briefs, like, just what are some things that we aren't thinking about that we could be doing to support? Would it have been helpful, and I'm not saying we would have done this, but what if Medill had written a letter of support, had been public when the Gulf of whatever was happening? So yeah, we'd just love to hear some things about what we can do with our stature, our brand, and our thought leader position.
As the academics sitting up here, you know, as I said earlier, you know, we do have this unique position, and yes, we still have it to provide this kind of support. And I'd like to give a shout out to the Medill's Local News Initiative, right? It's immense contribution that has been critical in providing these very intense, often disheartening reports like we had this week on the state of local news. But they also provide opportunities for journalists and media to evolve and grow, and yes, as Wendy McMahon urged us, to reinvent themselves. And so I urge you to go onto their website and look, see what they're doing. From my perspective, as the only joint faculty member on both Medill and the Pritzker School of Law, having the immense support of both schools to develop unique curriculum to train this generation of journalism students on how to learn about the law, and of course at the law school, how to apply freedom of information laws and other laws, but also training the next generation of law students on how to be effective media advocates and representatives. And we raise money to place them in the newsrooms to apply their trade of what skills and knowledge they have learned. And we also raise funding for 4 one-year fellowships so that a graduating law student can work in newsroom. And someone just last year worked at Associated Press, and while you were all very involved in all that litigation, she found herself running some training programs for FOIA and directly answering journalist questions and so on. So I think that is the role that we can do here, but I would love to actually hear from some other members of the audience as well, from my colleagues. Yes.
You mentioned sign-on statements and group statements, and I thought I should just chime in there. Our organization, Freedom of the Press Foundation, we operate a press freedom working group, and that is where a lot of the sign-on statements that you might see organizations like us or CPJ or RSF or various others sign on to comes from. One of us drafts it, circulates it to the working group, and we send it out. RCFP generally runs the sign-on statements that come from media outlets themselves as opposed to rights organizations. But if Medill or any other institution wants to be looped in on sign-on statements, let me know. I am happy to circulate them to you, and you can sign or not sign as you see fit. But I'm happy to work on that. It would be really helpful to have universities, in addition to press freedom organizations, on board with more of those efforts.
Natalie, that's such a great suggestion. And if Charles, I'd be happy to volunteer to be on any committee that can coordinate this activity. That would be great.
Just really quick to add to that, in our situation, the most prominent one I've been talking about today, the plaintiff actually, it was funny and actually kind of quite helpful to our defense that he did this, but he argued that we had violated journalistic ethics and standards. So a J school, perhaps the best J school in the country, Medill here, having the ability to add the sign-on or whatever would be enormously helpful, I think, in situations like that.
2 more questions? Yes.
Hi. Hello. Okay. Hi. My name's Angela. I am a recent Medill grad, 2025 BSJ grad. Ooh. I work for ABC7 Chicago in downtown. So I'm sure everyone has heard about the Jimmy Kimmel debacle and freedoms pertain to that. And I think what ultimately trickled down was not just the fact that this decision caught all of the news segments of ABC just out of the blue, but that it impacted most like the very local affiliates, and audiences were essentially doubting them, even though they had no role in the decision. So my question is, how can we push for freedom of speech when we have these corporate entities that, mixed in with politics, that have been backing our very existence?
Well, the Kimmel example was a good example because the Nexstar and Sinclair ABC affiliates didn't air it, and what happened is people started canceling their Hulu and Disney Plus subscriptions, and Bob Iger saw that and was like, okay, maybe Jimmy's been off the air long enough. So it had an economic impact. So you can vote with your pocketbooks. You can take action and not subscribe to services that you believe don't have the same values. So you do have power.
Anybody else? And our last question?
Hi, thanks for what you do, and especially to the journalists that were overseas. And the question for 2 of them. So having seen like state journalism uphand and maybe like working for CGTN TV, what should we as news consumers know when we watch state TV from other countries, whether it's RT or CGTN, et cetera? Thanks.
That they're going to put their country's perspective first. And that was also the case with Voice of America. We always put the U.S. perspective first. The difference is we have an editorial firewall that prevents government officials from interfering with our coverage. And we also wanted to model press freedom across the world. So other state-run media do not have those statutory requirements, frankly. But I would just say that, get your news from a wide variety of perspectives. Don't just watch Western media. Don't just watch, like the example I use for our Indonesian stations is they weren't hearing any of the Israeli perspective. They were just hearing, about the awful things, and they are awful things happening in Gaza, but they weren't getting the other side at all. So just make sure you have a balanced news diet.
I don't have much to add to that, except to say that whether you're reading it in a large media organization or from a smaller news organization, I think a key thing to see is whether it's reflective of the people it's impacting. So if there is news coverage of solar farms being built in Tibet, and you're talking about the development of that, have the voices of the people been actually included in that story? Has the cost of that development been covered in that story? And I think it's important to be able to see that. And also, I think what I mentioned earlier, that a lot of these terminologies, like colonial terminologies, are being used in, it's creeping in international media. Like Xizang is one, ethnic unity, and the difference will be whether it's in quotes or not, right? So, and then for consciousness and all of these terminologies that I think should make you question whether it is reflective of like uncensored, accurate news, or it is news with an agenda.
And be aware of the big stories that are taking shape. I mean, in the US-China relationship, critical minerals and chips are probably the two biggest issues in that relationship, because critical minerals are going to drive, the devices we hold, and chips are going to drive AI technology. And that's really, the future is going to be decided by how these things are hashed out in the most consequential US-China relationship.
Before I turn it over for Charles, I know he's itching to do the final comments. You raised a point, Chris, about the importance of technology. Before Clayton left, I asked him, what are the 3 areas that you think our audience should walk away from based on our panel's discussion? He mentioned Gaza, he mentioned China, but the third point he mentioned, which is getting increasing attention from the UN and other international agencies, is the role of big tech. And it's not just how their algorithms are designed against journalistic fact-based news reporting to favor incendiary, anti-journalistic, AI-generated information, but the engagement of big tech execs and companies within the political structure and the type of role that they want for eliminating regulation and developing more cozier relationships. So I'll just set that out on as a postscript. And Charles, take us home.
Thank you so much. Can I have one more round of applause for our panel? That was fantastic. Adam, Doreen, Chris, Julie, Tenzin, really, that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you to each of you for being with us. Unlike my colleague, Peter Slevin, I'm not an optimist. I'm a glass half empty person. But this has been so energizing and uplifting. It's been wonderful to be in community with people who care so much about press freedom. Thank you for giving us your time and attention over the past few days. I'm going to echo what Barbara Frank said. One of the things you can do is that you can support local media, right? You can support the outlets that the quality outlets that you care about. So let me encourage everyone to do that. But also, we have to stop just talking to each other. You're here because you care. You are the converted. We have to spread the word far and wide. So talk to your relatives, talk to your friends, buy subscriptions for your children and your grandchildren. That's the only way we're going to make a difference far and wide. We can't keep this conversation confined to the closed circle of those of us who understand this. We have to try as best we can to open the minds and hearts of those people who are convertible, who just are not paying the attention that those of us who tend to be news junkies and news consumers are playing. So again, reach out far and wide to those whom you love and tell them about the importance of this. Freedom of the press, as I said earlier, is not a journalism issue, it's a democracy issue. It's an issue that each and every one of us has to care about. And again, it's only together that we can begin to make a difference. One final program note, we are also sponsors of an event that's happening later today over in the McCormick Auditorium at in Norris Center. It is a film, Bad Press. We are working in conjunction with the Indigenous Journalists Association. It is about censorship on tribal lands of the Ojibwa community. It's a wonderful film that talks about very localized censorship and how a small tribal paper attempted to push back against the powers that be who were censoring them. If you have time, if we haven't worn you out over the past few days, I encourage you to go there. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Thank you for your support. Please follow our events. Again, support the local news initiative and support your local news. Take care and have a good weekend.